I tend to find I either have instant chemistry with people or no chemistry with them. And I tend to every year I get better at kind of trusting my instincts on that. But I felt like I had a immediate kind of chemistry with him, and we just got chatting, and it was wonderful. We're kind of goofing around a little bit, and I said to him, "Oh, we should get together for coffee or something sometime." He seemed like a fun dude, and I asked him eventually, "So what do you do for work?" And he said something like, I don't remember exactly what he said, but I think he said something like, "Oh, I own 27 companies."
Hey there, friends. This is Dennis Geelen, author of the Happy Accidents newsletter and the book, The Accidental Solopreneur. Welcome to another episode of the Happy Accidents podcast, where we dive into true stories of wildly successful people, products, or businesses, all of which can trace their success back to a chance encounter, a serendipitous event, or a fluke invention. In each episode, we unravel the tales of unexpected triumphs and the remarkable journeys that led to their incredible success. I'm on a mission to explore the fascinating world of happy accidents, and I'm thrilled to have you along for the ride. So, why should you tune in? Well, besides the entertainment value of these incredible stories, there's a hidden treasure trove of lessons that we can learn from them. Whether you're an entrepreneur, a creative mind, or simply someone who enjoys a good narrative, this podcast is your go-to source for inspiring stories and valuable insights. Get ready for a roller coaster ride of surprises, a dash of luck, and a sprinkle of wisdom. This is the Happy Accidents Podcast, where success meets serendipity. Let's jump into today's adventure. Matt Watkinson is an award-winning author, speaker, and consultant on customer experience and strategy. As a speaker, he's addressed industry leaders at every kind of organization imaginable, from Microsoft to the FBI. He's also the co-founder and CEO of Methodical, a customer experience and strategy consultancy based in California. And he's the author of 3 books, most recently Mastering Uncertainty, which is a book he co-authored recently with Chava Conkley. And that's going to be the basis of much of our discussion on the episode here today. So, Matt Watkinson, welcome to the Happy Accidents podcast.
Thank you so much. What a great name for a podcast.
Yeah,
Story
yeah,
of my life. Yeah.
yeah. That's great. We're going to dig into that. You've got some interesting stories from your own life to share. I've read quite a few of them from the book, but also some great stories from different businesses and things that have kind of come out of left field that have gone on to make, miraculous success stories. So I'm excited to dig into that today with you. But first, I just want to say I've read all 3 of your books. And it's 3, right? You haven't written any more yet. Am I behind or
No, 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 it's
we're at?
three. It's
Okay.
three. No plans for a
Yeah.
fourth.
No plans yet?
No, no
No.
ideas.
Right. Well, you never know when ideas will strike, but I'm excited to have you on because I've read all 3 of your books, and number one, I love your writing. So the 10 principles behind great customer experiences, just a super well written, structured book, great ideas, great stories in there. That kind of got me hooked and introduced to you. Then you came out with the grid. So
Yeah,
this was
big
much more of
one.
a, yeah, business strategy. And this is where your engineer mind really came to the forefront for me. And boy, I can see how this guy thinks, and he's really able to articulate that into his writing. And then obviously Mastering Uncertainty, a completely different kind of book, which shows, your level of thinking and experience. So beyond just enjoying your writing, I'm also excited to have you here because it seems to me like you and I have also taken a bit of a similar journey, at least in our thinking. I've written some books. I've done customer experience consulting, which then led into more strategy. And then that's kind of led me down this rabbit hole of serendipity and luck and randomness. So it's kind of neat that our thinking has kind of aligned that way. Was
Sure.
that a natural progression for you, do you think?
Um, I think anyone who's I suppose, open-minded, or receptive to new ideas, or perhaps more fundamentally than that, just reflects on what the world is showing them and teaching them, you're going to end up changing your mind about things, or you're going to end up realizing that almost everything is much more nuanced than you think it is.
Yeah.
And
As
and your worldview is going to evolve and change over time. At least you'd hope so. I mean, you would hope that. I think when I started writing the 10 principles must have been 20. I think I was 27 when I started writing that, and now I'm 41. So, you'd hope that in the span of 14 years, you've learned something, or you've grown, or you've developed, or your worldview has changed. That to me would be a good sign that you're growing and
yeah.
developing and everything. And it just so happens that each of the books I've written has really been the capstone, if you like, on a period of intensive study and personal growth and development. So the first book, The 10 Principles Behind Great Customer Experiences, I'd been a practitioner in the field for almost a decade or thereabouts, before writing it. And I was schooled to think in terms of principles and in terms of theory, and in terms of kind of almost determinism in my way of thinking about things. And that, I'm sorry about this, Dennis. I'll give you one. And that does, how you go? I'm sorry, just add some character to the podcast, especially given that we're talking about uncertainty. What my dog is going completely
There you
ape.
go.
Let's
Exhibit
not
A.
worry about it. He's being punished now. Yes, and that does work very neatly within the narrow chamber of a domain. So yes, within civil engineering, yes, within certain fields of like interaction design, accountancy, I guess, not that I know anything about that. When you're dealing with a narrow domain, there are a lot of principles and theory that you can lean on. Right? There definitely are, and it makes sense to use that, and it makes sense to study that as intensively as you can. But then in the second kind of turn of the wheel of my career, after the success of the first book, and nobody really wanted to pay me to design anything anymore, they just wanted me to talk about it and drink coffee and meet the boss and talk about strategy, which I didn't really know anything about at the time. When you start to deal with with multiple domains, as you're dealing with in an organization, or when you start to deal with the intersection between an organization and reality, really you find yourself in the world of systems, right? And you end up in the world of cause and effect, and you end up with emergent behaviors, and you end up with odd systems traps where like everybody gets what they want in theory, but no one actually gets what they need, kind of thing. Or decision making becomes a lot more about trade-offs, and it becomes a lot more about being able to have a sense of the whole and that kind of thing. So you go from really moving in thinking in terms of principles to thinking in terms of systems. So that was book one. And book two, The Grid, is a systems thinking approach to business and decision making. And I learned that because I realized, yes, these principles work within this domain, but they don't work when you start to try and deal across domains, right? Well, when you really get into thinking about systems, and when you really get into the world of strategy, and when you really start getting into the realm of entrepreneurship and that kind of thing, you realize that one of the key properties of a lot of dynamic systems is that they're not predictable. The behaviors of them are unpredictable. And we see that, obviously, even though we choose not to necessarily acknowledge it, you see that every single day in business. You see that every single day in your personal life. You see it every single day in world news. What makes the news, almost by definition, is things that are somewhat unexpected or new or novel or that kind of thing. So really, you find yourself dealing with the realm of probabilities and really dealing with the realm of uncertainty. So at each kind of stage in my personal career development, going from being a very hands-on UX UI designer or customer experience um, designer or thinker, whatever you want to call it, then moving more into the strategic side of things, and then being more and more involved in leading and running my own company and working with other entrepreneurs, you realize that there's these kind of three different modalities of thought, really. You've got these principles that work within a domain, systems that work within multiple domains, like within an organization, but then you have randomness, uncertainty, and probabilities that come into play whenever you're trying to do something new, whenever you're trying to innovate, whenever you're interacting with people who can always do weird, crazy, unexpected, and unpredictable things. And whenever you're dealing with the macroeconomic environment where you're subject to things like power laws and earthquakes, literal and metaphorical, forest fires, literal and metaphorical, and so forth. So it did, I know this is a very long answer, but it's important background. This did, yes, it's reflected the trajectory of my career, probably in the same way that it has with yours. And each of the books was really like, oh, okay, I recognize that this was a thing. I did my absolute best to learn about it and study it as intensively as I could and just be open-minded about where it would take me. And then the book is like the capstone on that period of intensive knowledge and development.
Yeah.
And they've been equally paced about 5 years
Yeah.
between them. And so now I kind of think in terms of this, for anyone who's a Harry Potter fan, kind of Deathly Hallows of business thinking would be, when you're working within a domain, do everything you can to learn about the principles of it, and use them to help you with your decision making. When you're looking at the level of an organization or you're looking at the level of strategy, you must think in terms of systems, try and identify the force multipliers, try and identify where the biggest trade-offs might be, try and identify the second order impact of decisions. So, if we cheat on emissions, for example, a la Volkswagen, what might the long-term complications of that be, rather than just on our short-term sales? And then really when you're trying to innovate or do something new or enter a new market or anything like that, really the third of the kind of Deathly Hallows is probabilistic thinking, running experiments, embracing uncertainty, and so on and so forth. And if you're aware that you've got these different kind of modalities of thinking and that you can apply them in different contexts, and you're likely to skew the odds of success, I would say, more in your favor, or perhaps if you don't succeed, you're likely to indulge in less kind of self-flagellation and beating yourself up about it, because it's just as much a likely cause of that failure that it was elements beyond your control in the first place.
Yeah. I just find it so interesting that, you wrote these books several years apart. I got the opportunity to read them within a shorter time span. So it's like an inside look into your thinking, your evolution of your thinking, your ability to unlearn and relearn. And it's almost like this narrative running in the back of my mind that each book, new book of yours that came out was kind of a, oh, in addition to that, oh, and also by the way, it's like you've discovered a new paradigm that you want to go back and say, in addition to my last book, here's what I'm thinking now. So it's kind of neat just to have that doorway into that.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, that's really gratifying to hear, because it has been it's been a journey. I suppose it reflects my own intellectual development, and there are kind of macro or meta lessons, I suppose, that you could take from it too, in that I did realize the limitations of each of these schools of thought, and I'm grateful that I've been kind of intellectually malleable enough to recognize the limits of my worldview when I've encountered them, and to have been coachable enough or mentorable enough, if that's a word, that when people were trying to say to me, no, you need to think like this, or, well, had you considered that I was, receptive enough to wanting to learn about these new ideas. So
Yeah.
in particular, I'd say I was very grateful to Chaba for learning from him in researching and writing this book, because really it's the knowledge in a macro sense, the worldview came from him. I was just lucky, speaking of happy accidents, that we crossed paths at a party that I wasn't even really invited to, actually, and then
Yeah.
hit it
Actually,
off.
that's where I wanted to kind of start. Before
And
we dive into the content of the book itself, share that background story about how you guys got together and what the motivation was for writing the book.
yeah, so Chaba, I was invited to a party. Yeah, I was invited to a party of another um, author in Hollywood. I was someone else's plus one. A colleague of mine invited me to join the party. So I wasn't like a primary guest. I was a secondary guest. Chaba was there. He was invited because he's a pretty well-known figure in Los Angeles, at least as an investor and an entrepreneur. And it was kind of a salon get-together kind of thing. It was at Keith Ferrazzi's house, actually. He wrote Never Eat Alone and a couple of other books. And I was introduced to him by someone who I'd met when I was speaking, actually, about the first book, the 10 Principles book, a lady called Diana McKenzie, who's now retired, but she, incredible woman who was CIO at Workday and prior to that Amgen. So
Oh, wow.
pretty, and has done a lot of, I think, for women in technology in particular. So a very inspirational and interesting person. Anyway, I met Chaba at this party. Yeah, and we just hit it off, really. I didn't really know anything about him. I wasn't really curious about him in a professional sense anyway, because I tend not to be. I tend to meet people and I I tend to find I either have instant chemistry with people or no chemistry with them. And I tend to, every year I get better at kind of trusting my instincts on that. But I felt like I had a immediate kind of chemistry with him, and we just got chatting, and it was wonderful. We're kind of goofing around a little bit, and I said to him, "Oh, we should get together for coffee or something sometime." He seemed like a fun dude, and I asked him eventually, "So what do you do for work?" And he said something like, I don't remember exactly what he said, but I think he said something like, "Oh, I own 27 companies," or something like
Just off the
bizarre.
cuff. Yeah.
Yeah, like or I have positions in 27 startups, and then the thing about Chaba is, really he keeps himself to himself. He's very low key. He's kind of humble and modest to a fault. I mean, he's confident and assertive, but he's also he's not the kind of person who wants to be in the public domain, really. He doesn't
Right.
trumpet his achievements from the top of a mountain. He was very nervous about writing the book together because he had imposter syndrome, which is kind of hilarious,
Right.
and that kind of thing. So yeah, very, very grounded. And we hit it off. We would go hiking. We would talk about things. We would talk about business. We would talk about what we've been reading. He's a voracious reader. I mean, I thought I was a voracious reader, but he really has a huge appetite for knowledge. And we were talking about things, and it just became apparent at some point that there was something fundamentally different in the way that we saw the world, or the way that we operated in the world, or the way that we acted in the world. And it really, after a while, I realized it was our attitude to risk and uncertainty. I was constantly trying to diminish it. I was constantly trying to expunge it. And I thought of business or decision making as a kind of intellectual contest where where if you didn't know the answer or if you were subject to uncertainty, it was just because you didn't know enough or you hadn't studied enough or you hadn't
Right.
gathered enough data and that of course was wrong, majorly wrong, because you just can't, the uncertainty is irreducible. And where Chaba was kind of 30 years ahead of me was in accepting uncertainty and then trying to make it work in his favor, or trying to act probabilistically so that he could make decisions where he had limited downside and
Mm.
potentially extremely high upside, and thinking much more in terms of serendipity and concepts like that, which were largely foreign to me at the time, or not foreign to me because they're not foreign to anyone. If you really stopped and think about it, you'd recognize them. But I suppose I was in denial
Mm.
about it. I'd kind of been brainwashed, I suppose, as most people have, into thinking that we live in a world where certainty is possible and there are kind of deterministic elements at the fore, and that you can analyze and strategize and plan your way into a successful outcome. And I was just lucky that I suppose was open-minded enough or receptive enough to realizing that wasn't true, and to realizing that even though I loved the grid and the ideas in it and systems thinking, what I learned from that really was that it has limits, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's how it came about. And the thinking was behind the book, well, I'd read, I don't know, 400 books on business and decision making by that point. I'd landed myself a senior fellowship at an MBA program at a prestigious business school. I'd 15 years as an advisor and practitioner. I'd worked all over the world. The thinking was, God, if I don't know this stuff, chances are that the majority of other people don't either. And he could just not believe that. He was like, this is all, in my world, this is obvious. And I was like, well, this is
Right.
great, because now we get to transmute that knowledge from one field to another and hopefully help other people with their kind of decision making too. So that was the thinking. It was a meeting of
Yeah.
minds. I learned a lot from him, and it was a really fun little project.
Yeah. And I just love that the whole genesis behind it was a happy accident. You're a not an original invite to this party. You're somebody else's plus one. You end up there. Just happen to run into Chaba, and his thinking opens up a whole new doorway for you. And the next thing you know, you guys are writing a book together.
Yeah, I mean, he wasn't even planning on going. I think that's the
Oh,
funny.
there you go.
He only decided to go, I think, at the last minute. So, I yeah, and this is the thing that I struggle to stop kind of noodling on once you start picking at it, is wow, like, how would life be different? How would life be different if I hadn't met him?
Yeah.
And the same, I think I wrote about the same genesis of the first book, the 10 Principles, that or how my career got started as well, both very happy accidents. In terms of the first book, I just happened to mention that I wanted to write to one of my best friend's brothers when I was over at their family home for a cup of tea. And he said that he was doing an internship at a literary agency, and that if I had a proposal, he put it on the boss's desk. The boss was um, a major league literary agent. I think he sold the foreign rights to Harry Potter.
Oh, wow.
I think he's represented a lot of Booker Prize winners, that kind of
Right.
thing. So the likelihood of me submitting a proposal through the front door and him reading it is converging on 0%. So yeah, I didn't have a proposal at the time. I just worked night, and he said I'm only there for another week. So I just literally worked like 20 hours a day to write this proposal to get it on his desk. And yeah, it was garbage. And he said as such. But the good thing was I met him at least and built a
Right.
relationship with him, and he helped me, more as a favor to his intern than anything else. And then he represented the grid, and he represented mastering uncertainty and sold
Oh,
those. those book
Wow.
deals, and was instrumental in helping me at least to secure that first publishing deal. So yeah, again, also with the beginning of my career, I read a free newspaper on a train that had a job advert in it. I applied for the job. The job was like as an IT recruiter, which is a job that I'd be spectacularly unsuited to, but I was only 18. I did get the job, and before I got fired, which was like a week, I crossed paths with a guy who was a kind of force to be reckoned with in the world of e-commerce and design, and he hired me out of college. Just maintain that relationship. So yeah, no, boarded a different train, maybe a different career, not
Yeah.
had that cup of tea, maybe no first book,
Hmm.
not got the proposal done, maybe no deal with Penguin Random House, not had the first book, definitely no dinner at Keith Ferrazzi's house, no dinner at Keith Ferrazzi's house, definitely no Chabba, no third book. At each step of the way, yeah, probably no books, radically different career choices. I mean, I feel like I would have. There are many alternative realities where I could have been very happy. There are many alternative realities where I could have done radically different things and found them very fulfilling. I think I'd have been happy as I've probably been happy as a mechanic or as I don't know, an architect or even in the military in some capacity. There's a number of worlds in which I could imagine myself being happy. There are a number of unimagined realities, of course, that could easily have happened
Yeah.
just as readily as the one that did. It's just interesting to think, in keeping with the motif of or thematic material of our conversation, that you can't really think of any major aspect of your life that wasn't in some way, shape, or form colored by an extraordinary confluence of factors having to come together to put you in the place at the time with the other person. And when you become attuned to it exactly as you are, and as I have become, you see it everywhere, even in the careers, the careers of all of the people that I admire the most. There's been this heavy element of serendipity, randomness. How they got the job in the first place was, well, I met this guy and he introduced me to somebody else, or how you meet your spouse or partner, or yeah, all of it is when you think about what must have happened to even put you on the earth at that time. You know,
Exactly. Yeah.
how far back do you want to go?
Yeah, there's so many contingent events have to happen exactly as they did in order for you to be here and to live the life that you did. I read a book recently. I'm not sure if you've read it. It's called Fluke. The author is Brian Klaas, Klaas. Very similar thinking to Mastering Uncertainty. That's what attracted me to it. But he gives his own story of, I think it's either his grandfather or his great grandfather was married to a lady who ended up actually having some mental health issues, killed herself and their children. He then remarries and has new children, and that was the new bloodline that led to Brian Klaas being born. And it's like those contingent events had to happen exactly the way they did, or I wouldn't even exist here today. But it kind of traces back to a tragic event, but here I am because of it, right? So, and I'm sure if you trace everybody's life back, there's incidents like that that had to happen.
Oh,
So,
certainly. I mean, there are a lot of people on the earth, and there's a lot of moving parts, and people say everything happens for a reason, but it's just as plausible that everything happens for no reason.
right.
And
Yep.
and, and it's up to us to find meaning in the events that happened,
Right.
rather than that the events are inherently
Yep.
meaningful. It's up for us to be alert to what the meaning could be in an event for us personally. And it's also yeah, I guess when you become attuned to this uncertainty and serendipity and randomness, yeah, and actually, let me just put a pin in that for a second. I think most people think of, and this was a kind of profound realization for me. I think most people think of uncertainty and randomness as having a negative valence, right? They think of these as
Mm,
bad things, but it's just as plausible that they're good things as they are bad things, because all the good things that happened in your life had an element of the winds of fortune blowing in your favor, right?
yep.
And or an element of serendipity or anything like that as well. So I guess the question becomes, okay, we accept the uncertainty now. So what? Like, what are the pragmatics? How do we make it
Exactly.
work in our
Yep.
favor, right? And I think
Yep.
that's where it gets really interesting for me, because that is, in fact, that is possible,
Yep.
and that's
And
what I
that's
learned.
that's
Sorry
that's
about
exactly how you've laid out the book, right? Like we've been talking about the element of chance, like for the last 10 minutes. It's there. Our world is inherently unpredictable. This is what you say in part one of the book. And in fact, your book is broken into three parts. First one is the element of chance, and you just go on to explain the world is unpredictable. Like it or not, most of us don't like it. We like comfort, we like safety, we like predictability, and we cling to this naive idea that everything does fit nicely in a box. But in reality, the world is unpredictable,
that.
right? You just talked about how you met Chaba. Yeah, I think in the book you talk about how you met your business partner, Ben, and how you guys got together and started Methodical. You give examples of how the weatherman can't even accurately predict the weather 4 days from now, even though he's got all this data and we've come all this way in technology. The world is inherently unpredictable.
But the good thing is, returning to this idea of the upside of all of this, is that if we take Chaba as a concept instead of a person, right? And we say Chaba represents an encounter with an individual that has a positive outcome, right? An encounter with a new individual that at some undetermined point, because I think it was a number of years of hanging out and going for dinner and hiking and getting to know each other's families and that kind of thing before we decided to write the book, right? If we take Chaba as a concept, and the concept is meeting people can create opportunity, then it becomes obvious that there's potentially anyone you meet is potentially Chaba in some way, shape, or form, right? So then you start to think, well, if everyone I meet is potentially Chaba in some way, shape, or form, there's an upside to meeting them for me and for them. How do I need to navigate my interactions with people? You don't need to be contrived, and you don't need to be robotic. And of course, there's chemistry, which I strongly believe in, and that kind of thing. But what do people know about you? What do you tell people about yourself? How much do you ask questions about other people? How much do you learn about them? Because it stands to reason that the more you know about other people and their interests and their passions and their goals and their careers, the more you can compute how you might be able to help them, or who you might be able to introduce them to, who might help them. And the more they know about you and your interests or passions or goals or personality or career expertise, whatever, the more they might file you away in this mental filing cabinet. And then when the need arises, they open the drawer and they go, I've got the man for you. And the phone rings or the WhatsApp goes bing bong or whatever it is. And suddenly there's an opportunity born. Or you just converse and opportunities kind of coalesce around it, right? So this is where ideas like luck surface area that we talk about in the book, or how you manage relationships and going through life as a host instead of a guest, extremely powerful concept.
Mm,
You start to realize that these are These are as strategic as anything that we think of as being strategy. We just don't think of these things as being strategic.
Right. Yeah.
You know,
It's
more people you
account.
meet, the more of them know what you're interested in, the better you listen to them, the more attentive you are to individuals' needs, the more value you create for other people, the more you act as a host in life and not a guest, the more opportunity comes around to
Yeah.
you. You just can't say, it's just that not everybody walks around with Chabba written on their head, so to speak. I mean, he doesn't.
Yeah.
So, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, that was actually my favorite. So there's three parts in the book. Part two is creating your own luck, where you dive into this quite a bit. Knowing that the world is inherently unpredictable. Now, how do you harness that? How do you create your own luck? And you give all kinds of great examples. You give all kinds of tactics and things, but really it's about getting out there and experiencing things, testing ideas, meeting people, sharing what's going on in your head. If you hadn't have mentioned, hey, I'm thinking about writing a book, would you have ever been introduced and had that opportunity to have the 10 principles published, right?
Well, exactly. And then I think the bigger lesson, probably the biggest lesson of all for me in the book, in terms of my own development and in terms of my day-to-day life as it stands now, the biggest gain has been the recognition that you should think in terms of downsides, not upsides, right? So
Mm,
instead of saying, here's my goal and how can I guarantee its accomplishment, and that kind of being upside thinking, I immediately began to think, well, in context A or B or C or whatever it is, what's my downside to doing A, B, C, or D? And if the downside is controllable and the downside is palatable, to try, just to try. And
mhm,
that has exponentially expanded my personal scope of opportunity, right? And what's
mm,
the downside to doing this podcast? What's the downside to spending a few bucks on something that might be great or might be bad? Well, it's a few dollars. It doesn't matter. If it works out, then great. And if it doesn't, the loss is controllable. The same extends into business. The same extends into everything, really. I think if you can change your mentality to think what's the downside rather than how can I guarantee an upside, you'll try more things, you'll experiment with more things, you'll be happier just in general, and life will be more colorful, vibrant, and exciting because you're doing
mm.
more interesting and
Yeah.
diverse things. And I think the other thing is just to acknowledge that when you're learning and growing and trying things for the first time, there are going to be setbacks and there are going to be difficulties, and you're going to be learning through a process of trial and error. And we don't say a process of trial, we say a process of trial and error because there's always error, right? And when those errors happen, the worst thing that you can do is kind of succumb to this hindsight bias and think, well, now I know that it didn't work. I could have known at the time that it wouldn't work, and I'm an idiot. And what did I do
Mm,
that for? And I'll never get where I want to be. And all this kind of negative chatter coming in, which is extraordinarily unhelpful, right? So, thinking in terms of downside, recognizing that learning involves trial and error can dramatically reduce the amount of stress and kind of misery in your life as you
yeah.
go to navigate the uncertain world we live in.
You think some of the most successful business founders or leaders deploy that type of thinking? What's the downside versus what's the upside?
Yes, absolutely. I can't conceive of another way that they would be able to take risks without losing their mind.
Mm,
I think often the difference between people who have been really successful and people who have accomplished a fraction of their potential is that they simply tried and were
yeah.
like, we'll figure it out as we go. I think everybody has a kind of mental model of what a good business decision maker looks like. And it's an interesting thing to try and reflect on for some people, because I think for a lot of people, it's like a chess grandmaster where they're anticipating 97 moves ahead, right? Or
Yeah.
they're a rocket scientist or a watchmaker, where everything is very complicated, but it's knowable, right? Whereas I don't think in those terms anymore. I think much more in my day-to-day work as a designer and writer or business person. I think of myself more of as a kind of craftsman or plumber, like where you have to be pragmatic about the circumstances you're in.
Yeah.
You have a job to do and you want to solve it in an elegant, well thought out way that's commercially viable. Right? Others might think of themselves as an artist.
Yeah.
You know, whatever you want to think about. But in terms of macro decision making, I think you can think of yourself as a scientist, but only if your definition of a scientist is somebody who is intensely curious about the world around them and
Testing
has
ideas.
hypotheses that they want to test by running experiments.
Yeah.
I mean, you can certainly apply the scientific method to decision making, and arguably that's the best way of doing it.
Mm.
Whether that in itself yields a body of scientific knowledge is a matter of some debate, because I'm not quite sure it does, but definitely the approach you can apply.
So are we at a point where there's a danger here because we have more and more access to information and data? Is that going to have more business leaders and founders feel comfortable in, well, we'll just look at all the historical data and that's going to help us make better decisions? Or with AI, are they going to be relying more on AI and feeling like, hey, this is going to help get rid of the uncertainty rather than leaning into the uncertainty like you advocate for?
Well, it's a very sticky area of conversation. So there are certainly areas where data is an ingredient for good decision making when combined with expert judgment. Right. So data doesn't make decisions for you. Data has to be gathered, it has to be interpreted, it has to be reported, and it has to be acted on, all of which has subjective elements to it, and all of which can be done with varying degrees of expertise. Right. So simply knowing, as my friend Robert Van Ossenbruggen's often saying, knowing what normal looks like is a good start. Are we normal? Knowing what kind of patterns are often visible in data, like the double jeopardy law, that loyalty increases with the size of the customer base, that kind of thing. Knowing that kind of stuff is expert judgment. Yeah, so we always need expert judgment when we're making decisions. And we also need to acknowledge that there are limitations to data. Obviously, all of it came from the past, and if the future isn't going to be like the past, then it might be of limited value. We need to acknowledge that there are various degrees of confidence that we can put in data, and most people don't communicate their data with confidence intervals. We also need to acknowledge that not all the data that we could gather is relevant, and not everything that's relevant can have data gathered in a kind of quantitative manner. You know, so again, back to one of the earlier things that we talked about in the conversation, I just wish people acknowledge that there's a lot more nuance to things than they like to think that there is.
Mm-hmm.
The holy grail for a lot of people is data-driven decision making. But the data we gather, or the data we think is important, or the way in which we interpret data is a function of our own values and our own
Yep.
biases and our own philosophy, right?
Yep.
So data and science, in a way, without wanting to be too esoteric, is always the child of humanities and philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think it comes down to your worldview in a lot of
Yeah.
ways.
Yeah. The way we interpret the data is a huge one for me. And I think it was Taleb in his book, The Black Swan, where he gives this example of the Thanksgiving turkey. Every day of its life, it gets up, does the same thing, eats its grain, goes for a run, everything's great. So now the data is telling him, hey, for hundreds of days in a row, this is my life. This is the pattern. This is the normal. Why
And
would I expect tomorrow to be any different until tomorrow is different and
exactly,
he's on the chopping block, right? So
exactly. And a lot of things are like that, we just kind of choose to screen them out. Um, we just choose to kind of screen them out, but it doesn't mean it's not happening that way. And I think it generally, there's a lot more. I feel like executives within large organizations in particular, it's not acceptable to say, I don't know. And the only thing that's more unacceptable than I don't know is I was wrong or we were wrong. And I think that's a cultural malaise that impedes everybody's growth. Because if we're in an uncertain world and we try something and it doesn't work, well, great. If we learn from it and we learn what will work, then we should do that instead. But we don't do that. Instead, we go, oh shit, this hasn't worked. How are we going to cover it up? How are we going to make it look like actually it did work? Or how are we
mm,
going to blame someone who isn't us for it
yeah,
not working? Rather than just going, well, look, we we were as diligent as we could be in the research. We were as cogent in our strategic thinking as we could be, but the world is uncertain and we tried it, and here's what we learned, and we need to change direction and do this.
mm,
That's the only sensible thing to do in the world that we live
yeah,
in. But it doesn't, it's a kind of cultural
yeah.
problem that you just can't do that. And I think that you can't do that. I think there's a chicken and egg element of it as well, which is because people are deceived by data, they think of it as being a fact. They don't realize that you can write fiction and
Right.
it's a planned word.
Yeah.
And they are overconfident in their plans because they think that we
Yeah.
live in a deterministic world.
Right.
So then when they are wrong, it's when they're wrong, instead of it being we live in an uncertain world, it's we're wrong and it's an indictment of my ability. And that's a really
It
dangerous
does
thing to be in.
it does take a lot of um humility and confidence to be able to not do the great cover up, cover your ass and make excuses and but when people do it well, admit they made a mistake, share what they learned, we applaud it. But for the most part, I mean, I love it when a sports general manager can say, you know what, I made a mistake signing that coach. I made a mistake trading for that player. I'm going to correct it. Most of them don't. They'll stick to that decision because they made that decision and, they're going to live and die by that decision. But when they actually do come out and correct it, it generally works out better and they're applauded for it. But I think it's this perceived sign of weakness that leaders have that I can't admit I may have made a mistake.
Yeah, it's really interesting and it's really curious, and a lot of it comes from hindsighting. Yeah, because you could just have easily made a mistake that had a positive outcome, and you can make great decisions that don't work out.
Yep.
I think it's an interesting kind of it sounds like I'm talking in riddles here, but we think that a great decision is one that yielded a great outcome. And in a sense, if you want to draw a straight line from one dot to another, in a sense that's correct, right? But it's actually entirely possible to make a great decision that doesn't have a great outcome. You could give the circumstance and the goal to like 100 brilliant thinkers, and they could all say, this is a well-reasoned, well thought out approach, right? No one will blame you for it. And it doesn't work out. And you can also make a bonkers, idiotic, terrible decision on paper that does actually, through events beyond your control conspiring in your favor, actually turn out okay. Probably done a few of those. So it's luck,
Yep.
basically. So I think we need to decouple for our own well-being, be capable of decoupling actions from outcomes and intent from outcomes and decision-making methodology from decision success. Because if there's a lot of noise and randomness and factors beyond our control that are also in the mix, well, the example that I really like to use is applying for a job. If you were to write a list of all the factors in your control when applying for a job, and then write a list of all the factors outside of your control when applying for a job, you would see that the list of factors beyond your control that influences the outcome probably 100 times longer than the list of factors within your control. So you do all the things that are in your control and you don't get the job. What do? You immediately think, why didn't I get the job? What's wrong with me? Am I an idiot? What's wrong with my CV? Am I really bad at my job? Do people hate me? Do I interview? Like all of this self-doubt, all of this hand-wringing, right? And fine, there might be opportunity for improvement, but it's just as possible that they'd already decided to hire the hiring manager's best mate. They'd already decided to promote from within, but HR insisted that they interview 10 people and you were just one of the 10. Or you didn't have great chemistry with Bob, even though Brian and Jenny really loved you. If you were to look at it rationally, you'd realize that the only way to get a job would be to play a numbers game and obviously do what you could, get coaching, get a great resume, blah, blah, blah. But to acknowledge that individual successful outcomes aren't within your control, so it has to be a numbers game.
Yeah. Yeah. Is it safe to say then, too many times we put way too much hope and faith and in a plan, in our decision-making process, and then not enough there's all these other external factors that are unpredictable, and we have a very hard time distinguishing between the two, but really that's what it takes to be able to thrive amongst uncertainty is to separate those two and say, hey, with the best information I had at the time, I made a good plan. The results, good or bad, part of it was in my control, a lot of it wasn't, and I'm okay with that.
It really, really comes down to the domain, I think, that you're dealing with and the degree of uncertainty within the domain, right? So the first question to ask yourself, I think, in any given circumstance is how much uncertainty am I contending with here? How many of the factors are within my control? How much is knowable? How much randomness is this subject to? And then allow that to shape your decision-making process, right? So let me give you a bit of a weird example. You may know, because you probably read it on the internet, that read it on LinkedIn, that I bought a massive vintage Airstream trailer.
I love that.
I can see it out the window of my office now, right? So part of restoring that Airstream is going to involve identifying the power infrastructure that it needs. So what power sources will it use? Will it use solar, propane, shore power from the house, battery power? How big a battery does it need? How do you convert solar power into battery power to charge it? What size gauge of wire do you need going from a solar power controller to a battery? These kinds of things, right?
Yep.
Well, this is a domain of very low uncertainty because V equals IR and the rest is kind of by the by, right? You can know what the voltage of the system is. You can, and as long as you know what your kind of power requirements are,
Right.
like if you know what your requirements are, sure, I need air conditioning, I need a coffee machine, I need charge my phone, blah 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 blah. You can work it out, and there's very low degrees of uncertainty in these kinds of situations. And I'm confronted with this situation at the moment. You can solve your problem with a spreadsheet, some swearing at the computer, a lot of research, and some circuit diagrams, and it's knowable. The answer's knowable. If you handed the problem to like an undergraduate electronic engineer in their third year, they'd just go and have it done in an hour. It's knowable. If it's knowable and it's a stable domain like physics, you can probably work it out. Other elements of it, of the project, are like more uncertain. Should I put a rug on this part of the floor? If I do, what color should it be? Will I like it? Will it look shit? Well, it might look shit, and the only way to really know is to try and visualize it or run an experiment or try it or mock it up in CAD or just take something from the house and see whether it works. Right? There are varying degrees of uncertainty in various different aspects of life and various different problems that we face. And it kind of goes back to what I was saying right at the beginning, which is almost in every project, even if we look at this Airstream trailer, you've got elements where you need to think in terms of specific principles. Voltage is current times V equals IR, right? That's a principle, Ohm's law, you can apply it. That's within the domain of electricity. When I think about the whole living space, I've got to think about it as a system, right? Which is systems thinking, right? Am I capable of actually doing the job? Am I capable of rebuilding this thing? Am I capable of doing it in a timeline that makes sense? Am I capable of lifting the shell off and putting it back on in one piece, or am I going to totally fuck it? The only way I'm going to know that is to try. I can't postulate about it endlessly. I have to actually at some point unlock the door, go in there with a screwdriver and start taking shit apart and seeing how I go and just saying, I'll learn. What's my downside to trying? So in everything, whether it's applying for a job, whether it's building silly caravans or motorcycles or trying to build a business or trying to accomplish anything, the first step is to understand how much uncertainty am I facing? Is this a situation where I can use principles? Yes. Is this something where knowledge from the past is reliable about the future? Yes or no? Do I need to think about this in a systems perspective, or do I need to think about this more kind of probabilistically? And then you can enhance your decision making. Where you get really miserable, I think, is when you start applying those mentalities where they don't belong, right? So in the domain of designing the power infrastructure for the trailer, I think it would be totally dumb to just buy a load of parts and see whether they work. It's going to be extremely expensive, and you're probably going to harm yourself.
Don't suggest it. Yeah.
I wouldn't suggest, well, let's just fucking try it out and see. Well, what's my downside? The downside is you might die. So don't do that. But you do see a lot of people going to these projects with this, like, let's just try it and see. And again, this comes back to this idea that the world is much more nuanced, right? We need to know which of these mentalities to apply in which circumstance and not apply the wrong mentality in the wrong circumstance. I think it's the kind of thing that I'm trying to get at.
Great advice. And that's really part 3 of the book, where you dive into a lot of the stuff. How do you thrive amongst uncertainty? There's lots of great advice in there for people just in their own personal life, but also a lot, obviously, for business leaders, business founders. We've, touched the tip of the iceberg today, but we've gone through all 3 parts of the book. Part 1, the world is inherently, it's unpredictable. Part 2, well, then knowing that, how do you create your own luck? And then part 3, now how do you thrive amongst this uncertainty? So I love it. I love your approach. I love your thinking to this. I'm so thankful that you came on the podcast today to share that with us. Before we wrap up, I just want to do a little bit of fun stuff. I
Hmm.
asked you ahead of time, um, some personal stuff that we can kind of talk about, and you said that you really admire people who are designers, engineers, artists, and sports people. You gave a few examples: James Dyson, Michael Jordan, John Mayer, Glenn Gould, a few others.
Mhm.
What is it about those types of people that you admire?
Well, okay, so the first thing is to say, I admire and respect anyone who can do anything that I can't, which is everyone. Okay. Like, so uh, everyone I know has cultivated some kind of ability in their life pretty much. I'm like, how do you do that? How does that work? You know, I mean, and I'm not saying I could never do them, but I have a real appreciation for anyone who's cultivated a level of skill in
Right.
anything. So that's just the baseline. I think I admire designers and engineers because that's the love of my life, right? Like, um, I just have an insane passion for it, and the same for music as well as a as a amateur player and as a listener. And I think the thing that I admire most about probably musicians and sports people is just the sheer level of self-discipline required to perform at an elite level
Yeah.
in any of these things, right? Like I really like I my friend James King, who wrote a wonderful book, Accelerating Excellence, says that excellence is doing ordinary things extraordinarily well. And I think that that's true, but it's very difficult to do ordinary
Yeah.
things extraordinarily well. Like to be absolutely consistent with your diet is very, very hard.
Hmm.
To be absolutely consistent in your rest, in your workout planning, or if you're a musician, in your practice, in your technique, in your I just find that that takes an incredible mindset
Yeah.
and then to perform under pressure as well, extraordinarily difficult stuff. To cope
Yeah.
with the uncertainty, I think in sports as well.
Yeah.
Incredible stuff. I think athletes and elite performers are, they're otherworldly to me.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I like designers and engineers just because that's my passion. And I think in most things in life, actually, there's a connection between knowledge and pleasure, right? I think the more you know about something, the more insane and annoying the world is when it's not right. But the more rapturous pleasure you get when it's done very well.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I have that feeling about design. Like sometimes I'm using an app or a website, I'm like, oof, man, they really thought about that. Like,
Mm.
can't see the actual sweat on the screen, but whoever designed that, they really, really took their time and they really
Right.
thought about that and they really got it
Yeah.
right. And I think the
Yeah.
same is true with physical products or environments or architecture
Yeah.
or that kind of thing. I guess it's just the field that I know most about. So, and writing, I suppose. And so I get the most pleasure from those things and the most
I
pain.
was, yeah, I was going to say writing as well. Now that I've written a few books, as I'm reading a book, I really take note of, boy, I really notice how well that person just articulated that, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. Wow, look how they drew me in and drew a picture if I'm writing fiction. Wow, look how they just took a really complex scenario and explained it simply. That's great writing. And I take note of those things now.
It's funny though, when I use a product for the first time, the first thing I see is the org chart of the company who made it. And when I read a book, it's funny, the first thing I start to think about, or one thing that's often apparent to me, is not how well written it is, it's how well edited it is.
Edited, yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because
Who is
that is
the
a real
editor?
skill. Editing is as hard as writing. I think it's a
Yes.
different skill, but it's very difficult. So It's a funny thing. It's funny you mentioned that. I'm the same when I'm reading. I can't read without being a writer, if you see what I mean. So whenever I'm reading anything, I'm like,
Yeah.
what verb choice was that? Or like, or like, why didn't an editor just put a red line straight through that? And I don't
Yeah.
say that from a position of any superiority or arrogance, by the way, because I've had my editor literally put a red line through
Yeah.
over half of my writing in one go. Just
Yeah.
don't need that. Rewrite this chapter.
Yeah.
All of that. So I've been through it, but yeah, it's funny how your knowledge affects your enjoyment of just about anything.
Yeah.
I'm an art idiot. So when I look at a painting, I just say whether I like it or not. And I've got friends who
Yeah.
are really into art, and they're like, "Look how the brush strokes through," and I'm like, "I don't see it. I don't know anything."
Right.
But that's
Yeah.
their field and their pleasure. Or
Right.
same with cooking.
Right.
Like I can't cook. I mean, I can eat, and I like taste food, but I can't cook, so I don't have the same appreciation
Appreciation.
for food
Yeah.
as somebody
Yeah.
who's a lot of time and energy becoming a kind of chef.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very good. Yeah, definitely a lot of appreciation for somebody who's gotten to the height of their field and does it well and does it under pressure, as you said. Matt, thanks again for being here. Anybody who has not picked up a copy of any three of your books, highly recommended. Matt, where can people go to connect with you?
I think social media is LinkedIn only these days, and yeah, my website's matt-watkinson.com. Email me there. The business is methodical.io. That's pretty much it.
Perfect. We'll add those links to the show notes. Matt, thanks for being here.
It's been a real pleasure, Dennis. I feel like it's been long overdue us having a long conversation. And I feel like we're kind of brothers in arms in a lot of ways. So I'm very grateful for you inviting me on. It's a real privilege.
Hey, thanks for tuning into the Happy Accidents podcast. I hope you find these stories as intriguing and insightful as I do. But make sure you don't miss an episode. You can subscribe to my Accidental Solopreneur channel on YouTube and watch these episodes in video form, or subscribe to the Happy Accidents podcast on Apple and Spotify for your listening pleasure. Until next time, stay lucky, my friends.